Welcome to From Rome.Info video. My name is Brother Alexis Bugnolo, and this is the documentary on Pope Benedict's Renunciation, Part 4. And in this episode, I'll discuss what the law requires a pope to do when to renounce the papacy. I will not discuss what Pope Benedict did. I will only discuss the law, because this documentary is entitled The Facts, the Laws, and the Consequences. So we've discussed the facts. Now let's discuss the law. Now, as I mentioned in my first program, when a pope renounces, he renounces as a man. My second program, that is. And therefore, he uses the I, because he has to separate himself from the office, and he acts as an individual. Therefore, he's subject to the law. One of the most common arguments from people who do not know their canon law, even canonists, they'll say, prima sedis nemini judicator. The first see is judged by no one. We're not talking about the apostolic see here. We're not even talking about the pope. We're talking about the man who is pope, and Pope Benedict agrees with me because he said, I declare. Okay. So that the man who is pope is subject to the law is the actual teaching of canon law. It says in Canon 12, to the universal laws of the church are bound all those for whom they have been given. So if there's a law about how a pope renounces, it binds the pope. That should be common sense. Why would you have a law about the pope renouncing if it didn't bind the man who's pope? Canon 11, to laws that are merely ecclesiastical abound all the baptized in the church, Catholic Church and who have the use of reason. Pope Benedict is a member of the Catholic Church as a man, Joseph Ratzinger, and he has the use of reason. Therefore, he's bound by the law. So those are the first things. Anyone who says the Pope is not bound by canon law is just an ignoramus. He doesn't know canon law. I don't care if they have 12 doctorates in canon law, because we're not talking about the Pope here. We're talking about the man who is Pope. And a lot of canonists have never even heard of that distinction. What do you mean the man who is Pope and the Pope is the man? Because they've never studied philosophy or theology. And as Pius X commanded, let no one receive a doctorate in canon law who does not already have a doctorate in theology, meaning you also have studied philosophy. And he declared the conferral of a doctorate in canon law upon anyone who did not have a doctorate in theology to be null and void. And that was a very good law. But it no longer is put in practice or enacted. A lot of people have degrees in canon law who don't have much formal training in anything else. So when they see that canon, prima sedis nemini judicator, the first see is judged by no one, they think it refers to the man who is pope and not the Roman pontiff in his decisions acting as a Roman pontiff. Because it says the first see, it doesn't say the Roman pontiff or the man who is pope. Okay, so the man who is pope is bound by the law, if there is a law about papal renunciations, and in fact, there is a law. It's called Canon 332, Section 2. You find it in the Code of Canon Law of 1983. And I will first read it in Latin, since it's very short, and it's going to be our basis of our entire discussion. Canon 332, Section 2, or also known as Paragraph 2, it has that unusual squiggle sign, but that means section. Si contingat ut Romanus Pontifex muneri sui renunciat, ad validitatem requiritur, ut renunciatio liberi fiat et riti manifestator, ut non vera ut aquopiam acceptator. Now, this is a very easy Latin. I think anyone with a second year study of Latin should understand that text, pretty much. But the translations that I have seen in modern language are all wrong. They don't do it right. So I will now give you an English accurate translation of what Pope John Paul II laid down regarding a papal renunciation. If it happens that a Roman pontiff renounce his munus, for validity there is required that the renunciation be freely done and duly manifested, but not that it be accepted by anyone whomsoever. Okay. So the first thing we can see by this law is it admits that something must be done and not be done. So a law, as I said, is in the first program, the laws of the Catholic Church are not suggestive; they're obligatory, obliging, and therefore, if John Paul II obliges the man who renounces, therefore the man is obliged, and he must do these things. So this canon is, I don't think almost anyone has discussed this canon well, except Kathy Carity in her blog, Canon Law Made Easy, acting as a kind of a prophetess. On January of 2013, that is a month before the Pope resigned, she published a blog post in which she said what a Pope must do if he renounces, and is it possible that his renunciation be invalid? And she said it's possible. And she's the only canonist I know has publicly said that. And since Pope Benedict's renunciation, no canonist will dare say that, as far as I can say, but I haven't read them in all the languages. But it's obvious from this canon that it can happen, because John Paul II says, if it happened that a Roman pontiff renounce his munus, for validity there is required that the renunciation be freely done and duly manifested. Okay, for validity there is required. That means there's a requirement, and if it's not done, it's not fulfilled, and therefore it's not valid. And in fact, John Paul II, in his Papal Law on Renunciations, on papal elections, in 3 places, speaks of a legal sede vacante. Well, obviously, if the Pope is dead, you have a legal sede vacante. So when John Paul II, in his Papal Law Universi Dominici Gregis, published in 1996, speaks about that the cardinals must first ascertain that there is a legal sede vacante, he means whether the renunciation is valid or not, if there is a renunciation, although he doesn't say it explicitly. So this is an obligation. The whole church has, the cardinals have, especially the cardinals, to see if this was done. In the next episode, the 5th episode, I'll discuss exactly what happened on February 2013, excuse me, February 11th of 2013. But right here, we'll just talk about the law. So let's look at it. If it happened that the Roman pontiff renounced. Now, a lot of people translate, if it happens that the Roman pontiff renounced, but this is a subjunctive, and subjunctives in English are not plural. Don't have that final S on them. If it happened that the Roman pontiff renounced. So, if it happened, continga, is a Latin verb referring to mere circumstances, mere events, occasions. It qualifies it in any way. If it continga, if it just happens. English happens is a very good translation. You could say occurs. It occurs in Italian, they say succede. That the Roman pontiff. Okay, so following if it happens, we have that the Roman pontiff. So the first clause, if it happens that the Roman pontiff, if it happens that a Roman pontiff renounces munus, is a conditional phrase. It begins with if, and the same as in English, that's a conditional phrase. Then the main sentence is, for validity there is required, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's the main sentence. But obviously the main sentence doesn't prevail if the condition isn't met. And this is one of the things almost no one will discuss since the time of Benedict's declaration. In fact, Cardinal Brandmüller wrote a whole academic paper on whether a pope can renounce, and he discussed Canon 332 many times, and he never once read that first phrase. He never discussed that first if phrase. He just discusses, for validity there's required. Now, I'm sure Cardinal Brandmüller is an intelligent man, but why he didn't do that is a question. I asked to meet with him in January, so I would be able to discuss that. He said he's sick. I guess he's still sick because he still hasn't granted me a meeting. Because perhaps he doesn't want to answer that question. But this is the whole crux of the problem. Because we don't even discuss whether there's a validity in a papal renunciation unless we're talking about a papal renunciation, and the law lays down when this takes place. If it happens that a Roman pontiff renounce his munus. So if we're going to discuss a papal renunciation, it's when the Pope has said, I renounce my munus, the Petrine munus, the munus of the Bishop of Rome, the munus of the Vicar of Christ, the munus of the successors of Peter. But he has to say, renounce the munus. And here we come to the legal a point of law. A legal act is judged on whether it is the act the law prescribes. Okay, whether it is the act the law prescribes means, does it have the essence that of the act that the law presupposes is the act being talked about? So this canon has to do with, doesn't have to do with papal renunciations. It has to do with renunciations made by the man who is the Roman pontiff when he is renouncing his munus. That's what it regards. If something else happens, this canon is inoperative, okay? It's not operative, okay? If the Pope is doing something else, if the Pope is saying, I renounce golfing, I renounce bananas, I resign myself to not going to the moon. He says anything else, it's not this. And this canon 332 is under the section for the Roman pontiff, and it refers to a juridical act. So a juridical act is when the Pope does something that has legal value and in a certain definitive way, and then therefore will have effects. If the Pope does something that's not a juridical act, then it's not, doesn't have legal value. If the Pope says to his butler, tomorrow morning I don't want poached eggs, I want hard-boiled eggs, the butler is going to do that. It's a command of the Pope, but it's not a juridical act, okay? Unless the Pope signs a document that says, henceforth all the eggs served me at breakfast shall be boiled and not parched, and he writes a document, then we could discuss if that's a juridical act, but just telling the butler is not a juridical act. Making any kind of statement to the cardinals is not a juridical act. If it happens that the Roman pontiff renounces munus, then we have a juridical act if it fulfills, because then we have to say, did the act fulfill these conditions? So there is now being produced out of Costa Rica and viewed on the YouTube channel Adorazione e Liberazione, a four-part canonical study of the same argument in Spanish, and the main argument is it has to be this act, okay? Because this is the act. If it's something else, it's not this act. And so if the Pope does renounce his munus, then we can talk about whether his renunciation is valid or not. He has to freely do it. That means it can't be constrained by unjust force. And it has to be vitae manifestator, duly manifested. Now, obviously, the verbs here, freely done and duly manifested, they each have an adverb, and the Latin here uses the ablative case. But they're verbs, that it be done and that it be manifested. Well, obviously, if what are these that it be done and that it be manifested? They're talking about a Pope renouncing his munus. And this is the second little trick you hear people say, oh, it's only necessary that it was free and that it was manifest. It's not, but they don't discuss what was free, what was manifest. And their basic argument is, well, the Pope could have done anything as long as it's free and manifest as renunciation. Well, obviously that doesn't make sense, and that's just not true. So in the Latin, when it says the main verb, the main clause, for validity there is required that the renunciation be freely made and duly manifested, that the renunciation, okay, what renunciation? The renunciation of the munus. Latin doesn't have the definitive article, but when it says renunciatio, it's referring to the act of renouncing. What act renouncing? The one that's in the subordinate clause that begins the sentence. If it happens that the Roman pontiff renounces munus. So that's the fundamental condition. And that's what the law requires. So, but what does this law mean? If you have some agenda, you're going to start doubting the law. And it's a very sad thing, but as soon as you see someone start saying, but what does it mean? You know that they're trying to attack the law, because if we look at this statement, we're just going to say, okay, this is the law. Let's wait for the Pope to say, I renounce my munus, the man who is Pope. And if it doesn't happen, well, then it didn't happen. That's just commonsensical. But if someone starts doubting the law, well, what does the word munus mean? Then you immediately know that he admits that Pope Benedict didn't fulfill the norms of law. He's trying to bend the canon so that what the Pope did fits what he claims the canon means. So anyone who even starts asking what the words mean is admitting that it didn't happen. Because if it did happen, he wouldn't even have to open that argument. If the Pope said, I renounce the Petrae Munus, you look at the canon, I renounce the munus. Okay, he did what the law said. So let's not discuss whether it's valid or not. They won't start saying, but what does munus mean? So as anyone who starts saying, what does munus mean? It's they've admitted that the Pope didn't accomplish what the law said. And of those who claim those things, they make assertions. I've never seen an argument from them at all, but at an academic conference in October of 2019, I gave a paper, an academic paper, on what the word munus means in canon law, because canon law is not an up for grabs your kind of thing. In canon 17, it specifies quite clearly how we are to read the law. It says, leges ecclesiasticam delenge sunt secundum proprium verborum significationem in textu et contextu consideratam, quasi dubia et obscura manserit ad locus parallelos siqui sint ad legis finem et circumstantias et ad mentem legislatores est recurrendum. Ecclesiastical laws are to be understood according to the proper signification of the words in the text and the consideration of the context, which, if doubts and obscure things remain, to parallel passages, if there are any, one must have recourse, and to the end of the law and circumstances or mind of the legislator. Okay, legislator. So, if we want to know what munus means, we must go to parallel passages in the law. Okay, and according to their proper sense. So, I did a whole study of canon law, and I looked at every instance of the word ministerium and a good number of munus. And it becomes evidence if you look at the Latin of the law, and you can do this at Intertext. They have an edition of the Latin of the Code of Canon Law where you can look up every verb. Or you can go to FromRome.Info video and look up the article Munus and Ministerium in the Code of Canon Law of John Paul II, 1983. You don't have to do like some canonists do. They've done a whole study going back to the Old Testament, New Testament, the Vulgate, the history of the church, and blah, 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 looking at the word munus means, and then start telling you what the word munus means. That's not what Canon 17 says. Canon 17 says you have to go to the code. You do not go to a dictionary, okay? Now, I know my Latin, so I know what the word munus means, but you don't do that, because the law says we must look at the law, okay? And if you look at the law, you'll see that there's different Latin words. There's dignitas, dignity, officium, office, munus, ministerium, ministry. Those are the Latin words that are key in this argument and this discussion. So munus is the problem we have in English, because in English we do have a word that refers to it, but it hasn't been used since like the 14th century. Now, maybe if you read books by about Robin Hood or the Knights of the Round Table, you've heard this English word. It's called charge, okay? As in the phrase, I charge you to care for the county of Suffolk and see to it that no bandits prevail in that region, okay? I charge you, okay? Charge is the Latin word here. We're talking about munus. Munus is a Latin word which comes from munire, the verb, which means to build up or fortify. It's a noun. Munus is a noun. It's not a verb. And it has to do with receiving the duty to do something, okay? I've been charged, and therefore I have the charge to do something. If you say that in English, most people won't understand you, because we don't use charge as a noun. It hasn't been used for centuries. And so I'll just talk about munus, lest we start confusing this situation. And now in other languages, they do and do not have. Italian has incarico, which is pretty much the same thing. Spanish has el cargo, which is nearly the same thing. French has charge, okay. German, German does have a word, Verantwortung, but that's not what the German code, in the Code of Canon Law, in the German edition that you find at the Vatican website, which obviously has been used by someone who's a German speaker because it has all these hyperlinks in it, so that could easily be used. So that's either Archbishop Ganswein or it was Pope Benedict himself. It's mistranslated. It's not translated as Verantwortung. It's translated as Dienst, which is service in English, but in Latin is ministerium. So in this canon, if the Roman Pontiff renounces munus, some Germans might think it's saying if the Roman Pontiff renounces ministerium, but that's not what it says. And if you posit a legal act in the Catholic Church because you're reading a translation that's wrong, and therefore you do the wrong thing and not do what the law requires, your act is invalid because you haven't done what the law requires. And that's why you should always have a canonist who knows his Latin well if you're a bishop before you act, and ask him to look it up, because the language of the church is Latin, and many nations were never civilized, so they don't know Latin. And that doesn't excuse you, because there's actually a canon saying that if you're ignorant of what is required for the law, that doesn't make your act valid. Okay, so one canon, Canon 125, I believe it says, is that a juridical act is presumed to be valid. Okay, and Canon Peters will quote this. He says it's a completely ridiculous argument in all these debates of a Benedict, because Canon 125 says if a juridical act is presumed to be valid. And I'll go to that canon because that's an important canon, because Canon Peters is playing a shell game like most dishonest people do. They're only going to quote part of the law and jingle that in front of your eyes to make you think that your argument is valid. Okay, it's Canon 124. It says, for the validity of a juridical act, there is required that it be posited by an able person, and that in it there be constituted essentially the act itself, as well as it observing all the formalities and requirements imposed by the law for the validity of the act. The juridic act posited in this due manner is to be regarded as regards to external elements, is presumed to be valid. So when Canon Peter says a juridical act is presumed to be valid and therefore all these arguments are false, he's not quoting what it says. It's presumed to be valid if it fulfills the requirements of the law. But the question is whether it fulfills the requirements of the law. So Canon Peters is playing a shell game. He's trying to get you to think that it fulfills the requirements of the law, and therefore you must presume it's valid. No, the law doesn't. Canon law does not say you presume juridical acts are valid. It says you presume they're valid if they fulfill the requirements of the law. So we read what the requirements of the law is. If a Roman Pontiff renounces munus, and the requirements are he freely does the renunciation and he duly manifests it. Okay. So let's get into the other requirements, so they're not essential here. Did he freely do it? Okay. Well, ask him. Did he freely do it? And if was he constrained? Obviously, he said it in front of all the cardinals. It appears that he freely did it. Was he coerced? Was he manipulated? And these are other questions. There's different levels of freedom. So if you were constrained to resign, it would be invalid, okay? And all that would mean is if you were manipulated into think of doing it because your coffee was drugged, your health was disabilitated, so you thought you couldn't do it anymore. Obviously, since the Pope said he didn't feel like he had the strength to run the papacy, and he's still alive for 7 years, there's some doubt as to why he thought he didn't have the health to continue governing. Because he obviously is still alive, so that is a question, and there are other issues involved. He was a year to the date before there was public reports that he was going to be assassinated if he didn't resign within a year. So those are debates about the freedom of the act. The other is vitae manifestator. I translate it as duly manifested, but it really means manifested according to the ritual prescribed. Okay, and something that is not done according to the ritual prescribed of the law is iritus in Latin. It's considered not to have been done. Iritus comes back from ritus, meaning it doesn't follow the ritual. And something that is iritus, not done according to the norms of law, is considered not to have ever been done. That's the nature of canon law. And it states that in one of the early canons. I think it's Canon 35. It states that, or 36. But manifested here. So in a renunciation of an office, you renounce it in the presence or to the person who gave you the office. But for the Pope, he only has to do it with 2 bishop witnesses that he said, who are testify that he did. Okay, and that's what the manifestation is. The rite, I already explained what that is. And so this canon is really beautiful. And it's not required that anyone accept it. So this canon is very beautiful because it avoids all the problems in a renunciation. Did he really renounce? So it has to be duly or ritually manifested. Did he manifest it in a way prescribed by the law? The law says if the Roman Pontiff renounces munus. And so if he says, I renounce the munus, he has accomplished the first condition. And if he said it in front of 2 bishops, then it's rite manifestator. So that is the first requirement of validity. And if he says he did it freely, we assume he's telling us the truth, unless you're sure you weren't threatening Holy Father. And those signs of, it's not like if someone had a gun in his head while he's reading it, then you can presume that it wasn't freely done. But if that's not the case, then it's pretty obvious that it's probably freely. But not that be accepted. So if the Pope renounces, and he freely does it and duly manifests it, but the cardinals don't want him to renounce, the fact that they don't want him to renounce doesn't make it valid. Okay, it's not a requirement for the validity. But not a requirement for validity also means it's not a cause of the validity. Okay, so if the Pope does something and all the cardinals say he renounced, does that make it a renunciation? No, it doesn't, because if it's not required for validity, it's certainly not the cause of the validity, okay? Which is would be an even more absurd claim. So these are the requirements of the law, and that's what it means for a Pope to renounce according to the Code of Canon Law. That's enough for this episode. My name is Brother Alexis Bugnolo, and this is the documentary on Pope Benedict's renunciation, the facts, the laws, and the consequences. Please let everyone else know about this program and share it, and you can embed it in any blog you want, even write your own commentary you like. Thank you for listening. In our next episode, I will discuss what happened that day, and if I have time in the episode, I will discuss why it's the conformity of his act to the law, but maybe that will be this episode 6. Thank you.